As Turkka introduced, CoDesign is one of the things I do, but it's the biggest chunk of all that I do. And I've titled this installation lecture, these are no longer called inauguration lectures, but installation lectures, CoDesign in the era of user participation. And as this is a lecture which is aimed for general academic public, what I'll do is that I first introduce the topic of CoDesign and through showing some of the projects that we've been running in it. I then sort of switch gears slightly and start talking about what do I mean by era of user participation, and finally look into the intersection of the two and what sort of research avenues then emerge. So let's go. So what is CoDesign? The folk definition of CoDesign runs along the lines of inclusion of non-designers in design activities. I, however, prefer a more restrictive and more dryly academic definition of what CoDesign is. It starts with the inclusion of the people that will be affected by design, often along professional designers, but not necessarily, as Turkka already introduced. People, non-designers, are in some occasions quite capable of designing for themselves without professionals. It means inclusion of these people in activities that alter the material and social shape of technology in its eventual use context. And it means inclusion in a direct way, not only by proxy through informing, consultation, or funding the professional designers, really hands-on, affecting the eventual shape of the product, service, or system that is being designed. And finally, it means inclusion of these people in decision-making during the process and regarding the desirable outcomes. Why I insist on such a Baroque definition? I think it's useful to have. It's not in no way a controversial definition, but I think it's useful to have this sort of more academic definition to retain focus on the typically thought after core benefits of CoDesign. CoDesign is not any involvement of users, but there are certain true strongholds in it that are actually quite hard to gain by any other means. So the question, why CoDesign in the first place? In the research literatures on CoDesign, which spread to something along the lines of 8 to 10 disciplines, however we want to count them, there are 4 sort of core benefits that I see. The first one is the difficulty of information transfer across domains, particularly across domains of users and developers and designers. The second one is that users can provide a formidable resource opportunity for design and development activities. Third one is that participation of users in democratic societies in their making of socio-technical change that will affect them is of paramount importance. And fourthly, and related to this, CoDesign is one of the key means in the toolset for achieving responsible design. What might this mean? I illustrate this briefly from 4 projects that we've been running. Let's first look at the difficulty and cost of information transfer. This is a notoriously thorny issue, and I want to sort of concretize that by recounting one of the first research projects that I was involved. We were studying software developed for diabetes professionals to handle the complex documentation that diabetes treatment was generating in Finland. It wasn't very long when we started on this project that we unearthed a graveyard of withdrawn diabetes databases. In 23 hospital districts that then existed in Finland, 21 had tried to create this kind of program and 20 had failed. There was only one that was sort of in relatively lukewarm use. Why had they failed? The producers and users held quite distinct competencies. The doctors, the nurses, the medical specialists that were treating the diabetes required years to learn how to do that job. The relevant knowing was embedded in their practices. It was learned part of membership and accumulation of skill. Same went for the software developers. It was not trivial to pass this knowledge across. Moreover, as only a fraction of it was relevant for design, and it wasn't at all easy to determine what fraction really needed to be transported across. And moreover, the different peoples involved had different interests and different priorities, what should be part of the treatment practice, and henceforth what should be recorded in these databases. The project that we followed as a sort of best practice case solved the problem quite elegantly. What they did was that they created collaborative design context where they drew all the seven key professional groups that were treating diabetes along the software designers, and together they could articulate not only what each of the groups required, but what sort of compromises and trade-offs could be made so that all of those peoples got their work together done, and the interconnections between them would work as well. The graveyard of diabetes databases sort of hints to the fact that this is not very easy. The figures also say the same. The developer-user collaboration was first noted as an important facet in the 1930s, when successes and failures of innovation projects have been systematically compared since the 1970s. It features among the top success or failure reasons. And these figures here come from the IT sector self-evaluation studies from Standish Group. You can see the success rate isn't exactly fantastic, and user involvement continues to feature among the top reasons that separates the successes and failures. This points to the other core issue about co-design. Why bother with co-design? Users can provide formidable resource opportunity. As we saw in the diabetes database study, the information that the users were providing for their small software company would have been probably insurmountable to get for this company. And indeed, it was insurmountably difficult to get for the people that came before them. But users can also provide solutions. Sometimes they do that without even professional designers involved. A more recent study that we pursued with Svetlana Uzunyuk in 2013, 2014, we looked into Arctic mobility and these ultralight wheels that people had been creating for that. We discovered that there had been 300 design variants, over 100,000 wheels in use, and manufacturers, professional designers had been trying for 3 decades to take over this class of quite successful technology, but incapable of doing so. The reason being that the user domain information in different branches of highly north areas was so highly varying that it was very hard for professionals to cater for all of those needs. And so it became more sensible for users to satisfy their own needs in their own specific locales. The third key benefit that co-design offers is democratic participation. Here I want to draw the example of an ongoing project where we've been consulting the building of Helsinki Central Library. It is a new flagship library built right downtown in Helsinki that aims to renew what libraries are, not only being hubs of cultural consumption of cultural products, but also becoming platforms for peer creation of new kinds of cultural productions. It would seem odd if the socio-technical opportunities that people create for themselves would then be designed by somebody somewhere in the back office without consulting them. And indeed, this is what City of Helsinki is active in doing. In this project, 11 different forms of collaborative design activities have been pursued, and many ideas from the citizens for the citizens on what kind of services, what sort of spaces ought to be built into this public library have then been found. Finally, I want to raise the issue of responsible design. And here I want to raise the example of an exemplary work from Aalto that I had the privilege to be part of. Andrea Bottero's work with the Active Seniors Association, where the expansion of the design timeline beyond the initial product launch into extensive design and use was able to generate an ICT infrastructure for a community of elders in realizing a new way of fulfilling elderly years of living in this communal arrangement. Here, CoDesign allowed the creation of kind of digital infrastructure which have notoriously poor success rates. ICT for elderly has a track record of failing something like 98% of the time, despite the millions that have been dumped into it. This one actually prospered very well. So, to sum up, what is CoDesign and why do it? It means inclusion of people that will be affected by design. The core rationale being that this addresses the difficulty of information transfer across domains. It doesn't mean involving any and odd people, but those people who are affected for the reason that then their requirements, desires, and needs can be truly addressed. It means involving them in activities that alter the shape of design for and in the eventual use context. And the rationale is that many people are very capable of engaging in design activities these days, not only professional designers. Thirdly, it means involving in a direct way and not only by proxy through informing, consultation, or funding, because this bestows citizens, users, consumers with possibilities to directly affect the socio-technical futures that they will encounter in their lives. And this links to decision-making during the process and regarding the desirable outcomes, as this is the backdrop for actually users having power to affect what kind of designs follow and what is desirable outcomes, henceforth how designers can become more responsible. Now, this isn't exactly new. You could basically read these core points from the early 1980s participatory design manifestos with slight alterations. What is new is that the landscape around CoDesign is shifting. What do I mean by the era of user participation, as was the subtitle of the participatory design conference last year? We came up, as Turkka mentioned in the opening talk, we came up with the book called New Production of Users, where we collected works that address what is changing in innovation collectives and involvement strategies currently. To highlight what this is about, I need to do a small recourse to two quotes and a bit of sort of putting things in context. Oftentimes, what is meant by era of participation runs along the lines of this quote. I want to read it out loud. We are passing through a kaleidoscopic era characterized by swift movements, social as well as economic, and such conditions cannot fail to bring more rapid changes in taste, desires, and habits of consuming public. So it becomes increasingly important that we provide the means for keeping our products and our policies sensitively attuned to these changing conditions. In the same place where this quote comes from, it was followed by noting that how modern consumers need to be served the way they want to be served. Changing conditions, rapid kaleidoscopic era of swift movements, yes, that might characterize us. These people were, however, living in the 1930s when General Motors was first introducing consumer research. This is not what I mean by new era of participation. Clearly, this was the first era of user participation when they became involved in industrial production in mass. If we fast forward to 2000s, the kind of movement that was began in 1930s, I think, was still coming to fruition, and I don't think it's far-fetched to say that by 2000s, the dominant view was that few users hold other than insignificant proactive capabilities. Managers and designers were reluctant to engage with users and downplayed their value. There was relative scarcity of methods and skills in the market, particularly for involving users, a bit more for studying them. And henceforth, user involvement was seen as maverick activity with an empowering undertone, typically conducted by partisan designers and academics. And finally, regard of user involvement was seen either as value per se, deemed unviable for larger scale operations, or sold by consultants as a bit of sort of design stardust, that, okay, we do collaborative design, this is something new and funky, we don't really need to explain what is it that we actually do. Since then, things have changed very rapidly. What we've seen is intensification, and I want us to start with 1930s. This is not that users suddenly jumped out of the woodwork and we are in this era of participation, but what we've seen is new intensification in user creativity and the involvement strategies that they've been rendered productive. This concerns the matter at hand, the stream of opinions, ideas, new uses, subversions, alterations, technical solutions that are generated by users and the width by which this is taking place in society. And it concerns the form, the ways by which users become productive. Independent digital sites, usability testing, automated tracking, user group convening, crowdfunding, crowd evaluation, idea contest, open design, and very importantly, all of these things becoming mainstream. There is nothing really astonishing in any of these labels. Rewind your brains back to 2000, this would have been funky. It's no longer very funky. And what I mean by new production of users is that it has become a simple fact of life that users have significant productive capabilities and that these are exercised widely in society. Nobody finds it at all weird that a t-shirt company like Threadless that basically is selling t-shirt designs doesn't do any design. They have a platform on which people volunteer their designs, other people vote on which designs are good, and yet other people purchase those t-shirts. It's all outsourced to users. User involvement has become a key object of industrial strategizing. This doesn't only concern this sort of new business models like the Threadless, but we see giants like Procter & Gamble, Oracle, SAP launching into user involvement in very clever and fine-tuned ways. There are wide efforts to produce productive users. Thirdly, the active users, the designers and the managers all operate in a landscape where methods and resources for user involvement are widely available. And this means, on the other hand, that the four core benefits that CoDesign can offer, they are no longer necessarily hardwired to empowerment. Empowerment can happen, but this is no longer a default case. And it doesn't mean, interestingly enough, that user involvement would suddenly become easy or automated. Users are responding to new strategies to render them productive, and people are not stupid. It's a sort of evolving landscape, evolving game on how designers seek to empower, produce, and exploit users, and how users then respond as citizens, as consumers, to those attempts. This leads me to a conclusion on what sort of research avenues I see in the intersection between what is CoDesign and what is the new production of users or the era of user participation. There are some continued research avenues we certainly should not forsake. Firstly, we need to continue advocacy. As CoDesign is being practiced in ever new settings, it is important to continue voicing that this kind of design approach can be very viable and useful in these settings. Secondly, we need to continue method and framework building. New settings and new aims require renewing the tools of CoDesign, its methods and its processes. This hasn't disappeared anywhere. Thirdly, as I already hinted in how I saw the new production of users and the era of participation, academics need to combat the outright exploitative ways of utilizing CoDesign, and they need to engage in enhancing its potential in empowering. This means restating and re-articulating the principles of design participation in ever new settings. And finally, we need to hold tradition alive. CoDesign is interesting in that when new areas suddenly discover that, oh, citizens are actually quite smart, oh, they engage with technologies, oh, they're quite capable in doing design activities, the basic facets are rediscovered and added onto every so often. It's better to connect those with all the work that's been done before. Now, these are continued research avenues, and I think they are very worthy. There are some emerging research avenues that I think we need to address. Firstly, I already hinted that the temporally extended CoDesign approaches are something that need to be paid increasing attention. Co-design is not only concept design activity, nor does it stop at the point of prototype, or at least we should insist that it does not. The real impact from co-design typically requires that we have long-term engagements with particular products, product lines, particular services, particular communities. And this requires further development. We've launched a new project with Jack Whalen and Tuuli Mattelmäki, who's here speaking next, on looking at mundane and strategic organizing of co-design. What does it take to actually pursue co-design in industry, in public sector, in peer-to-peer initiatives, in the era of participation? And finally, I think the time is becoming, if not is already here, that the 8 to 10 different disciplines that have contributed to co-design would need to start engage in a more in-depth dialogue with each other. We need to start theoretically elaborating the disciplinary interconnections in more detail than we've done before. In summary, what I argued in this talk is that it makes sense to define co-design more tightly in order to retain focus on its main benefits. This has become accentuated as the era of user participation is renewing the production of productive users and production by these productive users. And finally, this calls for new types of research that are becoming increasingly urgent along the continuation of the existing ones. I look forward to working on these questions with you in the next 20-something years.